So today what we're going to do is we're going to go over a baseline of terms just to get everyone clear and on the same page on what this what we're talking about. And then we're going to talk about what assimilation and respectability politics mean. What is the good immigrant narrative? Examples of how it's harmful, and then ways to combat it and to take action. Can I have the next slide, please? So I want to set some guidelines and some expectations for how we're going to be together in this space. My background, so I'm a social worker and I'm a community organizer, and I think creating a space for how we are together and what we all agree to is really, really important. So the first thing is this is a learning space for all of us. I will be learning with you. You'll be learning together, and I really want to encourage and take some of that time for us to be able to be honest and to create a space that is fruitful. So named that curiosity and judgment can't coexist. One of my team members shared this principle with us of like allowing ourselves to be curious and also to remove judgment. These next two, so no carceral language and no I words. So these are really important to me. I'll share a little bit more of my story, but I've been undocumented really, with the exception of DACA, which is a temporary protection, basically my whole life in the U.S. And I often heard really horrible, demeaning language that dehumanizes my experience. So no I words, so meaning illegal. So human beings, people cannot be illegal. So we'll refrain from using that word. And we'll also refrain from using language like prisoner or inmate, language that removes people's humanity. But we also want to be kind to ourselves. So we don't want to freeze ourselves or others in time. So this means that if harm is caused in this space, that we acknowledge it, that we work to address it, and then we also work on how to repairing that we don't just freeze somebody in time based on a mistake that they've made. We want to light up the chat. So I know the Zoom presentations are hard, and we're going to be staring at a screen for a long time. So as much as you're able, would love to hear your thoughts in the chat, for you to put them directly on there, and for there to be cross conversation on the chat. Ask questions. If something's not clear, feel free to interrupt or feel free to put it in the chat. I'm going to try to be monitoring that as much as possible. So if there's things that you're not clear about, feel free to put them on there. And then we also want to make this as accessible for everybody. So there's some closed captioning. We have a visual up here, but if there's anything you need, maybe the event presenters can put their contact information on the chat, or can say like who to reach out to in case you're having any problems with your audio or your tech, that they may reach out to support. Yes, thank you. So Maya is going to be our support. Is there any other principles or guidelines that we want for being together? You can take yourself off mute, or you can put them in the chat. I think the only one that I might add for myself is just like, take care of yourself and your body. If you need to move around and stretch, if you need to get some water, tea, just, take care of yourself. Any other ones? Okay, so we'll just keep these in the back of our minds as principles, how we're going to be together. And as we're going through the presentation, encourage you, especially the one about asking questions and lighting up the chat. Would love for this space to be a place where we can collaborate together. Can I have the next slide, please? So before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that we are on Indigenous land, that there are people that came before us who have paved the way for us to be doing this work, and that many people, including myself, have been disconnected from this ancestry. So my journey, I would love to share my journey a little bit about my connection to the land and finding that connection to the land. It's been long, and it's been hard sometimes. So as I shared, I'm not a U.S. citizen, and this isn't because of lack of trying or desire. It's because our immigration system doesn't allow for me to go apply to become a U.S. citizen. That process doesn't exist. And for a really long time, I thought that I didn't have a claim to this space, to this land. I bought into capitalistic and white supremacist ideas that borders define your connection to the land, and that because I was born on the other side of the US border meant that I couldn't be connected to the ground beneath me. In 2016, I traveled back to Mexico after not being there for 17 years. And I wish that I could say that it felt like a homecoming. It didn't. Instead, every day I counted the days until I could return back to my home in Michigan. And once I was here, back in Michigan, I started to examine my relationship to the land, the home of the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations. I think about my relationship to the water and how I've spent 2/3 of my life being surrounded by lakes so big they feel impossible. I think about the colors of the fall and how every year the bush by my parents' house looks like it's on fire. And how every year that very same bush serves as a home to tiny birds that fly over borders. In 2016, when I went to Mexico and I was exposed to indigenous communities and I heard their native languages. I left Mexico when I was too little to really understand my own indigenous culture. But I was old enough to understand that being called Indian was an insult. I remember vividly wanting to wear my hair in 2 braids down my sides and my dad saying that I looked like an Indian, implying that was a bad thing. Here in the US, I'm stuck in the middle. The identity of Mexican or Latina is not a race. And I'm certainly not white, even though the US Census wants to classify me as that. But my own family has never identified as Indigenous. And now as an adult, I'm starting to slowly feel comfortable enough to claim my own indigeneity. To know and recognize that even though I've been disconnected from my Indigenous history, the blood of the Purepecha, Otomi, and Huichol peoples runs through me. Their connection to the land, their resistance, and their struggles live within me. Similarly, as I think about the work here in Michigan, the stories and experiences of undocumented people who have been forcibly displaced from their home live within me too. Together, we have learned to reclaim a home near the water, a home that lets us live in solidarity with our Anishinaabe relatives, a home we fight for together. I want us to think about the land that we're on, the areas now known as Chicago, the area that is now known as Chicago, as the land of the Kickapoo, the Peoria, the Potawatomi, and the Miami people. Let us vow to acknowledge the people that stood here before us and to honor the land, the earth, and our ancestors as we care for each other. So I have on here, I'll put it in the chat, a website where you can go and be able to identify what land you're standing on. And would encourage all of you to take a moment to do that. And if you are able to also put that in the chat. So just give people about 30 seconds or so. You can click on the link, and then based on the search function, you can click based on either the city or the zip code where you're on, and to put the name of the indigenous people that lived in that place, to put it in the chat. Thanks, Allison. So I see a few people putting it on there. And it could be that you are in a place that had multiple Indigenous nations living there, but mine as well. Thank you. Okay, next slide. I want to do a little bit of grounding. I've done a lot of these presentations before, and I'm very, very conscious of the fact that I can be in spaces like this because I have a college degree, because I speak English, I have access to technology, and access to a network that's allowing these opportunities for me. But I also want to remember and keep in mind the people, the undocumented people who are not public about their stories, the ones who have been deported, the ones who are not in college. And this quote here, like, you matter, they matter, their stories matter. And I want to hold that and ground ourselves in that as we go into this conversation of what it means to create narratives and spaces where all undocumented people are seen and loved and heard. Next slide. So I wanted to share, now that I shared a little bit about myself in the land acknowledgement, but I want to share, start off with a story. And we do this in organizing, so I'll just ask you to bear with me a little bit. This is my organizing practice coming through, that we start off spaces with stories as a way to share about who we are and why we're doing this work, and also to invite people into that work. So here's a few pictures of me. I actually just did a very similar presentation on my story, so I had this ready to go. So the picture all the way on the left, that's little me when I was in Mexico. The following one that's my dad, my brother, and then the little girl wearing pink on the right is my cousin. And in the middle picture, that's my partner Juan, and then all the way to the right is my nephew Elijah. So these are the people that I think about when I think about why I'm doing this work. And 3 years ago, I was sitting at my office at the office of a previous job, and I got a phone call from a woman named Lourdes. And I picked up the phone, and she said, "I'm being deported in 3 months, and somebody told me that you could help." I never met Lourdes, and I had heard of her, but actually to this day, I have no idea how she got my phone number. So as I was sitting on the phone with her, all I could think about was my mom and how I would want someone to respond to her. And I thought about how when my mom, my brother, and I first moved to the US, we learned English much faster than her. And oftentimes, she relied on me as the oldest to interpret for our family. I remember being 11 years old and interpreting doctor's letters and legal records, and sometimes being really afraid that I wasn't quite getting the translation correctly because so much of it depended on me. And I remember being loaned out as a family interpreter and making phone calls to schedule appointments for people and wondering if there were kids in other places who had the same responsibilities that I did. But I didn't mind because I was proud to be able to help my family, because this is who we were. We took care of each other. We took care of each other when a family friend, Victor, was deported, and we sat in his wife's living room without him crying and thinking of ways to keep him safe, keep his family safe. We took care of each other after the 2016 election when I was at the University of Michigan, and I called a meeting for undocumented students, and we sat at a university basement eating pizza and talking about our backup plans in case our work permits were rescinded, but also how we would fight back. Because sometimes it feels like most of my life I've been fighting back. And for the first time, with the opportunity not only to fight back, but to be proactive. So when Lourdes asked me if I would help her, I knew what I would do. I would fight for her and for her family, but also for my own family. And I wouldn't just stop there, because it wasn't just about immigration. It was about all the other children out there who were just like myself, who once were afraid and confused and had too many responsibilities. It's about our humanity. It's about people who are poor, who are incarcerated, who are hurting. And I would keep fighting, and I would keep envisioning a world where we're all free. So that's why I'm doing this work now, because it doesn't matter if you speak English or you don't, or you've been deported. It's what matters is our humanity and how we're all working to be free. So next slide. So I want to share just a baseline of what some of these terms mean. And so these are very, very elementary, so I apologize if you are familiar with them or have heard them. I just wanted to make sure that I was using terms that everyone was on the same page about and what they meant. So the first one, I'll be using the word undocumented. So undocumented is someone without the legal paperwork that allows them to live and work in the US. Oftentimes people are undocumented because they crossed a border without permission, or they came into the US and they had perhaps a visa, or they had some kind of document that allowed them into the US, but then either they lost that because they couldn't renew it, or it expired, or sometimes things happen. For example, a very close friend of mine who is here, her husband has a student visa, and even though she has status through him, if for some reason they decided they were not going to be in a relationship anymore and they were going to separate, she would lose her status and she would have to go back to her home country. So there's a lot of reasons why people become undocumented, and some are not always very clear cut. For myself, I came to the US with a tourist visa when I was 9 years old. Then my mom had applied for my brother and I to come and see our dad, who had been living here in the US. And then the tourist visa only allowed us to be in the US for 6 months. But after 6 months, my parents were forced to make the decision of, do we have half our family stay here in the US and have half go back to Mexico, or do we stay here in spite of what's going to happen? And ultimately, my parents decided that it was best for our family and for us, my brother and I, to stay in the US. And it is a decision that I hope I never have to make. I know that it was really difficult, and it's a decision that I will be forever grateful to my parents for making that choice. That really has provided me with a much different lifestyle than I could have ever have had if we had returned back to Mexico. The other one is DACA. So DACA stands for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. It's been very famous in the news. There's been lots of back and forth. So it's an Obama-era executive action, and it's an immigration benefit that allowed certain immigrants that arrived to the U.S. as children to be able to work in the U.S. legally. The thing about DACA is that it's not a law, it's an executive action, which means that the president, as Trump tried to revoke it. And there was a lot of court battles. Ultimately went to the Supreme Court. It was upheld because the reason that Trump gave to terminate DACA was actually not sufficient. It didn't mean that he didn't have the legal capacity to do it. It just meant that the justification for ending DACA was not enough. And then there's DAPA, which we didn't hear about as much, but it's an important one for what I'll be talking about. So DAPA is Deferred Action for Parent Accountability. So this was also under Obama, so another executive action that would have given immigration benefits similar to DACA to parents who had U.S. citizen children. It was introduced, I believe, in maybe 2014 or 2015 by President Obama, and immediately faced a hurdle of legal challenge. Just ultimately went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided that they couldn't rule on it. They had basically a tie, and there was no action forced on that, so it continued to just not be in effect. And then legal permanent resident. So this is a permanent immigration benefit, sometimes referred to as a green card, because at one time the immigration like benefit cards for legal permanent residents were green, so that name has sort of stuck. They're no longer green. And this is oftentimes when immigration advocates talk about like a permanent solution, this would be one step right below permanent. So this is right before you become a U.S. citizen, you're a legal permanent resident. You could lose your legal permanent residency if there's a variety of reasons, but that's one step below becoming a U.S. citizen. Is there any questions on what do these terms mean? And feel free to come off mute if that works, or put it in the chat. Okay. All right. Well, if there are any questions, feel free to jump in there with anything that might come up. So we're going to be spending a lot of time talking about kind of hard topics, to be honest. So again, just take care of yourself and take care of your body. I wanted to start off. We're all pretty familiar with what it means to assimilate, what assimilation is. For me, it was helpful to think about the fact that this has been happening for decades and decades and decades. So this is the history, unfortunately, of the U.S. that started with the genocide of indigenous people, the enslavement of African people, and a complete erasure of people of color, of Black and indigenous people of color in the U.S. And that for so long, we've been told that America's a melting pot, whatever that means, and that somehow we've had to all come into this pot and be changed by it, and adapt was already there. But in reality, what has happened and what we continue to see happening is the erasure and the experiences of Black and indigenous people of color, by being forced to assimilate into the dominant narratives, dominant being primarily white, Christian, male narratives. And that undocumented people have also been forced to do this as a way of survival. So we know that assimilation often is not a choice, that people are forced into this, that indigenous people, so here on the picture of the right is schools that indigenous children were pulled away and separated from their families and forced into these boarding schools where their language, their heritage, their families were disconnected and stripped away from them. And oftentimes children were punished for speaking their language, for wearing their traditional regalia, and that assimilation is not often a choice. So just naming that it is a survival mechanism, and that we do it because we need to. On the picture of the left is three boys. It says 3 Lakota boys around the 1900s. So 3 boys dressed in their traditional wear outfits, and then 3 boys forced to assimilate and to wear more Western looking outfits. So this has been happening for a long time, and undocumented people, as I shared, are no exception to this. Undocumented people are forced into assimilation in many different ways. Sometimes it is through language. Sometimes it's through like the absolute like erasure of where they came from and how they got into this country. I'll share a couple of stories. So one of myself, as I shared, I moved to the U.S. when I was 9, and I don't know if anyone else has had this experience. All of a sudden, I wasn't sure how to pronounce my own name. When people would ask me as a 10-year-old, when I was being asked what my name was, I wanted to give my full name that I knew was my name in Spanish, which is Maria Ibarra-Frayre. I'm sure the captions are not going to catch any of that. And then all of a sudden here, realized that one, most people didn't have two last names, and the way that I pronounced my name, people weren't understanding what I was saying. And at 10 years old, I didn't have the awareness or really the know-how of like, how do I go about navigating what my own name is, and experimented with like, okay, how do I pronounce my name in a way that people are going to understand? Maria is pretty simple, but how do I pronounce my last name in a way that is going to be understood, and that when I say it, I'm not going to have to spell it out every time? And it's been actually a long and like journey to come back to me having two last names and just being able to own that and like say it confidently, like my last name is Ibarra-Frayre, and not feel like I have to somehow change it so it's more palatable for somebody hearing it. Other examples of what that assimilation looks like is plenty of friends who like the language has just been completely disconnected, where for reasons of like either they weren't allowed to speak it, people who have been in the US for a long time, in 1930s, 40s, where they were not allowed to speak Spanish, and that language connection has been lost through the years. Or people who have been shamed into losing that. So for some, various reasons, either you're trying to adapt into a new lifestyle or a new life and leaving behind sometimes really painful memories of your home country is the only way to survive. It is the only way to fit into the mainstream and not have any questions asked. There was a time when people, even now, I actually still catch myself doing this all the time. When people ask me, like, where are you from? My automatic answer is something like Detroit, because I don't want to go into this long history of like, okay, well, I'm originally from Mexico. No, I haven't been there in a long time. This is why I haven't gone back, and having to provide a long, detailed of why. I just automatically go to, I'm from Detroit. I'm going to pause here to see if there's anyone who would want to share. Maybe they've had similar experiences, or where as much as you feel comfortable, if any of this is relevant to your experiences. Yeah, thank you. So in the chat saying, I always say I'm from Chicago, even though people want to hear that I am from India. Another one, small example, but I've heard lots of stories from when our parents moved to the US and couldn't find the coconut milk spices to make the Sri Lankan Tamil foods they were used to, so our family recipes adapted to fit what they could find in an American grocery store. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, I feel that. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your stories and your examples. Like even simple things like the food and having to prepare food in a different way because you know that you're not going to find the recipes or the ingredients that you know your food needs. Yeah, it's hard. And it's a way that our cultures and our backgrounds and family histories have been erased. So that this forced assimilation leads us into respectability politics. And I actually just learned this definition. So there's a journalist who, to full disclosure, I have yet to read her work. Her name is Sarah Milano, and she describes respectability politics as what happens when a minority or marginalized groups of people are told or tell themselves that in order to receive better treatment from the group in power, so again, the group in power usually being white, Christian, male, they must behave better, or they must behave differently to align themselves to the group in power. Can I have the next slide? So I'll add here that this group in power for undocumented immigrants is traditionally U.S. citizens and sometimes even allies. We see this idea of respectability politics happening all the time. Everyone can think of well-intentioned white women that oftentimes tell Black youth that they have to wear certain clothing, or that they have to speak in a particular way in order to be respected, or in order to get a job, or unfortunately, sometimes even behave or look a certain way in order to survive. We're seeing this more and more, how young Black men have been killed, murdered in the streets because of the way that they looked, and that their murderers would use their clothing as justification for them for Black young men becoming a threat. And I share this with so much pain and hurt, and also recognition that respectability politics is killing us, is killing our people. This idea that we have to be able to fit and conform into some kind of way of living. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to have what we need in order to survive, in order to get a job, provide for our families. And respectability politics has also infiltrated into immigration spaces. I started organizing when I was in college, around like 20, I think it was like around 2010. And now, 10 years later, I see it so clearly. But at that time, it wasn't always so obvious what we were doing. I look back with shame and regret on some of the rhetoric and some of the policies that we were pushing for, and some of the public actions that we took, specifically working for the youth immigrant rights movement, where we were talking about the DREAM Act. So the DREAM Act was and is a federal bill that would allow certain young people that, again, came to the U.S. as children to be able to permanently fix their legal status if they went through a series of things like graduating high school. Sometimes it involved college. Sometimes it involved the military. And the basis of it is that you had to somehow fit a certain criteria in order to benefit from this immigration law. And I remember being quite literally the poster child. So my face wasn't a poster that was shared by Senator Dick Durbin on the Senate floor, stating all the reasons why I deserve to stay in the U.S. But none of those reasons were about my humanity, or even the reparations that I believe that the U.S. owes Mexico after decades of disastrous trade agreements and political interventions. No, the reasons that Dick Durbin mentioned why I deserved to stay in the U.S. was because I was a star student, and I was in college, and I spoke English, and I had assimilated into American life. And I think I remember him saying words like, "She's American in just any other way that you're American." And it wasn't that I was rebelling against the idea of what it meant to be American. That's like a whole different conversation. It was that the reason for why I deserved to stay in the U.S. was because I fit the criteria of what it meant to be a successful immigrant. And we saw this happen over and over and over again. So I have a couple examples that I want to talk about. So there's that one about my personal experience with organizing, but I also want to share a few actions and work that we actually have come to a place where we can actually move away from respectability politics and push against those boundaries. So if you go to the next slide, so I want to share a little bit about Lame Duck in 2018. So I work for an organization called We the People Michigan, and we do multiracial organizing across the state. And in 2018, the state of Michigan elected a Democratic governor, Secretary of State, and Attorney General. But all the Senate and the House of Representatives stayed Republican. So what we were going to see is a huge change in some of the power structures, but not others. So what this led was to a very incredibly destructive lame duck session. So the lame duck session is a period after an election, in between when the election's over and when the new set of representatives takes over. So it's usually after Thanksgiving and between Christmas, so about the month and a half, where representatives are still in office, but they've either lost or won their election or they're term limited. Either way, there's not a lot of consequences for them. But they still get to make and sign laws, which is wild, and actually even more concerning that the majority of laws that get passed during a legislative session happen during lame duck, which is, again, really, really disastrous and dangerous because there's very little accountability during that time. So typically, the legislative process is that whenever a bill is coming up for a committee hearing, that people come and they have the committee as a hearing. You can sign up to speak in advance and you get 2 minutes. And most people are not engaged in this because it's inaccessible and it's boring. And you only get 18 hours notice for a committee hearing. So that means that if I wanted to, like, there could be a committee hearing for a bill and I only have to give the public 18 hours notice. So there were some really terrible bills that we're going to introduce during the lame duck session. Bills ranging from removing protections to wetlands in Michigan, to even like removing in Michigan, you can recycle cans and you get 10 cents back. Like removing that was one of the least popular ones, which I think is really funny. Another one this one actually did pass, unfortunately, made it really, really difficult for communities and citizens to collect petitions for ballot initiatives. They put a string of like restrictions that make it really difficult to collect those signatures for ballot initiatives. They also, after politics, because it's kind of like very like legislatively kind of messy. So in that same fall during election, the people of Michigan voted on a ballot initiative to increase the minimum wage and to provide paid sick leave. So that was during the election, during a ballot initiative. What the legislature, the Michigan legislature did was, before these two, they were approved, but they hadn't been passed into law. What they did is they signed them into law, but then added an amendment to have them be less money for new minimum wage and less time for paid sick time. So then what was now in place was this new version of earned paid sick time and a minimum wage that was less benefits than the ones that was passed by the people of Michigan in the election. So all of this background context for what I'm about to explain, which is that what we did was we hosted the People's Lobby. That's what we called it. And what we did is we trained people to come into the Capitol and into these committee hearings and ask to speak directly with representatives. Usually those conversations with representatives, they happen at the lobby floor outside of the chambers. So outside the House and the Senate chambers. And usually what happens is that a lobbyist will call a representative and they'll have a secret conversation, and you won't, like, it's just a secret conversation that nobody knows what happened. Instead, we wanted to interrupt that and have regular community members just show up and be able to call the representatives directly and to speak with them. And then if you see at the right, there's a boom mic. On the picture of the right, there's like a boom mic that's like hand from the right hand. So what we did is then we took giant boom mics and we interrupted the conversations that were happening between the lobbyists and the representatives, because our approach was that if there's going to be some secret dealings going on between lobbyists and representatives, community needs to know about this. There shouldn't be any backdoor deals that are happening between lobbyists and representatives. And we were able to interrupt this process. This usually like very formal, you come in with a suit, you sit down, you write your note to the representative. We were able to interrupt that process and have regular people being able to submit testimonies and speak with their representatives and have that process accessible to people. So that's one example of how we've been able to fight and move away from respectability politics. The other example, yep, I think you can stay on that slide. So the other example, actually, if you go back to the one right before, the one that says, yeah, perfect. The other one is Cosecha. So Cosecha is an incredible organization. They're nationwide, but then they also have chapters in not each state, but several states in various cities. So there's a chapter in Michigan, and they had an action, I believe this was 2 years ago, pre-COVID, where I think it might have been May Day, so May 1st, they had an action where they had people come in, and Cosecha members come dressed in their traditional regalia and do a protest inside the Capitol. So you can see there are people here that are dressed in traditional Mexican dresses from their own countries, and they went in and sang in Spanish and did had a celebration of their heritage, and also asking for driver's licenses. So right now in the state of Michigan, if you are undocumented, you cannot receive a driver's license or an ID. So this was to push and bring attention to the fact that Michigan has a diverse and rich immigrant community, and that immigrant communities are important and vital to the work. So they went in and they celebrated, they sang in Spanish. They had this space, and it was a really beautiful interruption, again, of what it means to be in the Capitol, that are usually like Capitol buildings and legislative buildings are stuffy and there's suitcases and people wearing suits, and trying to disrupt what that looks like. The heartbreaking part of this is that after the action, we heard from, these were from allies, actual legislative allies, so representatives who supported the driver's license bill. We heard that they thought that this protest was ridiculous, and that we community members didn't understand how power works. So that's why that we had this. And it was really heartbreaking to hear representatives lean into these ideas that you can't be joyful or you can't have speak Spanish in the Capitol because we're being disruptive, and to equate leaning into your heritage as disruptive, because instead you have to in these spaces be aligning yourself with the dominant narratives. So I want to name and be explicit, like there's a difference between you leaning into your heritage and being disrespectful and being dangerous. In spring of this year, it was April of this year, we saw actual white supremacists with guns, with machine guns, take over the Capitol in Michigan. They went in, similar to how they were in DC, this happened in Michigan. They went in without masks, being loud. They were allowed to carry in machine guns. Meanwhile, Cosecha members were not allowed to bring in their banner. This banner here in purple, the cloth, it says licenses, it's in Spanish. That these community members, these Cosecha members, immigrants, primarily women, were seen as disruptive and chaotic when white supremacists with AK-47s, there was no question, there was no statement coming out about how this was disruptive or how about this was dangerous. So I just want to equate and put those two in perspective, that sometimes we're told that our community is being disrespectful, or that we're being loud, or that we're being too much, while at the same time, people with guns get away with things like this. So this, what I want to emphasize is that it's very easy to fall into these respectability politics. People, we heard these comments from allies, from co-sponsors of the bill, that we were being disruptive. And what it actually does, it leads into these divide and conquer tactics, where all of a sudden a representative can rule off a whole group of people and say, I'm not going to listen to them because they're disruptive. And actually, the only people that I'm going to listen to are the people that are coming in and they're speaking English, or they're sitting down and they have a paper document for me. And to create these levels of who is worthy of a conversation and who's worthy of a representative's time and who is not. Okay, I'm going to pause there to see if there are any questions or comments. I haven't talked this long in a long time. I make fun of my supervisor that he can talk nonstop for hours, and I'm doing the same thing now. If there are any comments, I can go back to them. So feel free to keep, in case you're typing anything. Yeah, thank you. So I think the existence of H-1B visas is another instance where immigrants need to fit a certain mold criteria in order to be granted entry. So H-1B visas are given to people with a particular kind of skill set or background to come into the U.S., where that is not accessible for everybody. And I think it creates this level and weight of who has access to be able to come into the U.S., who do we allow in this country versus who we don't. If you could go to the next slide. Yep, thank you. So how does this fit into this good immigrant narrative? So, we see sort of like a snowball effect that starts with assimilation, that then forces us into respectability politics, that then creates this good immigrant narrative. And it reinforces the idea that immigrants deserve rights and dignity because of their ability to assimilate, to speak English, or obtain a certain kind of education. And that the people who deserve to stay in this country are people who fit a particular kind of criteria. So this happens. I see this happen a lot. I perpetuated a lot of these good immigrant narratives. When I was organizing for the DREAM Act, I would say things like, I'm not a criminal. I deserve to be here. I am American just as any of you. And again, a reminder that some of these narratives are created as a form of survival. And at the moment when we were sharing some of these rhetorics and narratives, it was because we thought that this was the way to win. And we thought that if we could paint ourselves as poor, innocent children that had no say in the matter of being brought into the US, then people would sympathize and empathize with us and would let us stay. And it's taken me a decade, 10 years, to figure out that I actually don't want people's sympathy, that there's no amount of sympathy that is actually going to make me find my own dignity and my own worth. And what I'm actually looking for is power. What I'm actually looking for is power for undocumented and immigrant communities, for us to be able to fight and get what we need. Then nobody's going to give it to us. No one's going to feel bad. No one's going to go into their own moral compass and provide any kind of solution. That if something's going to be different for undocumented people, it's because we are organizing ourselves enough to the point where we're powerful enough to get it. So I have a couple pictures here. So these are, it's me in the middle. And actually, I still know a bunch of these people. They're in the picture, where we organized and shared our stories, and were able to do this work again as a means to survive and be able to advocate for ourselves. But all along the way, the immigrant rights movement, I think, has learned a lot and has learned lots of lessons. One of the readings that I shared is a book called, I actually just ordered from you're not going to be able to see it. It's like blending in. It's called We're Not Dreamers by Lacey Abrego and Genevieve Negron Gonzalez, that asks the experiences of undocumented people in the US. And I get this label often of like a dreamer, because this was people who qualified under the DREAM Act. And it's actually got to the point where I don't want to be associated as a dreamer. Like, just so many things that happened within the immigrant rights movement, and some of the lessons that we learned, and some of the harm that we caused has helped me see that we were pushing for what we thought was ideal, that in reality sort of fragmented our community, because the DREAM Act didn't benefit, and would not benefit, even if it passed tomorrow, would not benefit my parents. My parents would still be undocumented. People that I love would still be undocumented. And what it's creating is these different categories of worth that divide people. We saw this again with DACA. So DACA is very, very specific. If you arrive a day late, I believe the deadline for when you must have arrived to the US was June 15th, 2007. So that means if you arrive to the US on June 16th, 2007, you don't qualify. So that's what I mean by like these categories that are like very arbitrary. They don't actually, some of these don't actually make sense. Like, it doesn't make sense that this is a classification date, but that's just the way they put it. And what we're actually working towards is narratives and laws that would allow everyone to have their full humanity. And I'm an organizer, so I know that you have to start somewhere, and you have to have goals that are strategic and attainable, and that sometimes you cut your losses and you go with what's available. No, I would not give up DACA. If I had, like, it's sort of like, we're being forced to be put in these positions, and I recognize that, like, as we're organizing, as we're building the power of our communities to be able to get what they want, that we have to start somewhere, and that totally get that. However, it doesn't mean that we get there at the expense of someone else, that we don't get there at the expense of our parents, of people who, there's undocumented children now, undocumented young people who don't qualify for DACA because it came after, and that we don't hold certain people up at the expense of somebody else. We're seeing this. Let me see. Can you go to the next slide? We're seeing some of this right now, this like pitting people against each other and fighting for particular groups of people. So one of the big fights that we have right now, as I shared in Michigan, is our driver's license fight to get driver's licenses back for undocumented people. And every once in a while, this has happened twice already, we get well-meaning representatives who want to introduce their own version of a driver's license bill that is not as comprehensive. So the one that I'm thinking of right now, we have a representative who wants to introduce a driver's license bill that would actually has to do with H-1B visas that would provide, I don't quite fully understand it, but it would provide driver's licenses for up to 4 years for recipients of H-1B visas. And to us, we're like, well, why don't you just join on and support our bill? Because our bill would be for everybody who is undocumented or everyone who's an immigrant, regardless of what kind of visa you have. You would all fit into this. And the response that we've gotten from this representative is like, yeah, that's not realistic. But actually, their bill is not going to pass either way because the Michigan legislature is not immigrant friendly. Like neither of these bills have a realistic chance of passing within the next year. So we know that, then why don't we just go ahead and fight and dream a little bigger and encompass a wider scope of people instead of just very specific on this particular population. And again, I'm all for strategy. I am all for being clear and having a goal that is that's ambitious and attainable. And I do believe that there is a way to do it in a way that doesn't throw other people under the bus. Like, I believe in abundance. I believe that our communities are creative and they're powerful. And we don't have to do this in a way that puts people against each other. Okay, and I'll pause there again to see if there are any questions or comments. Yeah, thank you. So a comment on here, I want to share that another example of this narrative is a myth of the model minority that is often forced upon Asian immigrants and Asian American youth. Mm-hmm. Yeah. From Dina, I think it's strong that you point out they created the idea of a good immigrant as a survival mechanism to be accepted here. Yeah, definitely, 100%. It's powerful and it's important to recognize that, and also to both be kind and wary of it, to be kind, being kind to ourselves, that this is a way that we've had to survive, and also to recognize it so we don't enforce and inflict that kind of decision making onto newer generations. Okay, so we can go to the next slide. So now what we're going to do is we're going to be in breakout groups. So I have some reflection questions here that I will put in the chat. I think we'll do groups of maybe Maybe 5 people. And let's do groups for 15 minutes, groups of 5 people. And the questions on here for reflection is, what assumptions do you make of immigrants who don't speak English and why? In what ways have you or your family been forced to assimilate? What are some ways that we can celebrate differences without tokenizing people? And how do we make the immigrant rights movement more inclusive for people from all walks of life? No, I don't want the takeaway to be as like, no, you can't fight for anything because then it's going to leave people out. Like, we're never going to get to a full inclusive kind of policy or legislative or program that fully encompasses everybody. Like, it's not going to exist. That's what a full liberation of our people, like, that's not going to be within our lifetimes. So I don't want the takeaway to be that you can't start because you're never going to get to some kind of like full encompassing of everybody. But instead, what does it mean to fight towards policy changes or progress or programs that are conscious of the fact that people are coming from all kinds of different spaces and they have language that is inclusive, so we're not recreating harmful narratives through our own work. So I want to introduce the concept of what we're calling within my work within We the People Michigan, we're calling it a race-class narrative. And this has actually been used in various other organizing spaces. So it's messaging that has been proven successful in achieving electoral victories and advance a progressive policy agenda from big cities to small towns across America and the world, and explicitly talks about race and class. So it's a messaging framework that is very clear about the fact that we have to be talking about both race and class, and we have to be creating messages that are inclusive. Because people are like, they're going to be filling in the blanks for themselves. So when we say things like rioters or, yeah, I guess I'll go with that. Like we've been so programmed in the way the media works that like automatically paints a picture of like, who are these people? And it's based around like what the dominant narrative wants us to believe, which is that like rioters are like dangerous, usually brown or Black people, when in reality, like the people, like we need to be talking about the people that are protesting are actually like responding to some real difficult emotional like grief about the murder of our communities. So how do we create messages that allow people to have the full scope of what we're talking about without people creating like filling in the blanks for themselves in a way that we don't want them to? So if you go to the next slide, I have some examples of race-class narrative that we've been using for immigration, where we are more intentional about naming people so they're heard and they're seen, and so we're having a race-forward approach instead of this like colorblind situation like got us to this place to begin with. So an example of this is, we want, and these are all Michigan focused. So, if you can replace the Michigan, Detroit locations for a different place. It could be applicable anywhere. So we want a community where all of us have dignity and are treated like full human beings, no exceptions. And you all show up to support farm workers and communities. So we use this one because about 2 weeks ago, there was an amendment that was being attached to like the budget discussion at the federal level that was going to freeze farm workers' pay for 2 years. So we had to scramble late up the night, like literally like 11:45 p.m. the day, like that night, to push out a message saying, have everybody call your senator in Michigan, Senators Biden and Stabenow, and tell them to vote no for this amendment to freeze farm worker pays, because they just had voted against allowing undocumented people to be to receive COVID benefits from the stimulus. So Michigan was one of the few states that had both our senators vote against having undocumented people receive COVID benefit checks from the stimulus package. Ultimately, it was not binding, so that didn't go through, but the message was still, we still heard it from them that both our senators are against undocumented, like they're not standing in line with undocumented people. So this is one of the messages that we put out there. The other one is whether we're Black, white, or brown, from the Upper Peninsula or Detroit, most of us work hard for our families. So this naming explicitly, instead of just saying all of us, but to be explicit, like who are all of us? We're Black, brown, white, from various places in the state. And this third one, so Stabenow, Peters and Stabenow, these are the Michigan senators, must respect the will of the people to build a Michigan where all of us, Black or brown, young or old, established or newcomer immigrant, are cared for. And again, just being really, really intentional and being very direct about like who all of us is. So it's clear, it's there, it's not in all of us, it just looks like white people, or just looks like U.S. citizens. It's all of us, and clear that regardless of whether you've been here or you're new to the country, that we're all cared for. So I wanted to share this as like a way to highlight the fact that there are narratives that we can be pushing out. There is a way to start to change some of the language and some of the framework that we use when we talk about immigrants. It doesn't mean that everything's going to change, is that all of a sudden going to be just removed, or that somehow everything's going to be better for undocumented people. But for me, if I ever walk into a space and there's like a clear, explicit language about like immigrants are welcome here in this space, like I'm going to feel better being there, and what's going to make me much more likely to go back into this place, to a place that is clear and explicit about what they stand for and who they are. So if you can go to the next slide, there are a few, so actually, well, I'll pause. So this is, yeah, go back, yep, that one. So I just want to share this as an example of one of our messaging campaigns. So we have, we put out these posters and created some cards of this idea of like, we need all of us, and we need to fund our futures. So this was specific about like state budget work that was going on, but the message of we need all of us, just being clear that like we're creating a future in a world where there's space for everyone, regardless of where they come from. So I just wanted to share this cute little graphic. And then next slide. So just like taking action. So there was a lot of information that was shared today. Just want to leave with a few like tidbits of what you could do. For local policies, I recognize that it's a different state. So you're in Illinois. I don't know as much about what's going on locally, but for you to do some research on what is the local policy happening in regards to immigration. So for the city of Chicago, what's the police response to immigration? What's the social services response to immigration? Can you be clear and also know that you're going to be safe if you disclose to your social worker, to your doctor, or even maybe sometimes if need be like police departments that you're undocumented, like what's the policy on that? So for healthcare, in our small group, we were talking about the fact that like many of us had experience in a small group being interpreters for our parents as children for like medical settings, which is widely inappropriate that we had to do that. And I'd be willing to bet that it probably still happens in some places. what kind of language access or resources does your, healthcare agency offer? And then for education, how do I make it my responsibility to learn more about the issue? And my friend Bill uses this analogy often, is that like people are willing to go on YouTube and learn how to do all these like crazy things to fix their house, or go in and learn these new things, but like aren't willing to just read a book on a subject, or watch a video about like what immigration policies look like. So taking the time to do that. And then the last one is like awareness. How do I keep in mind that immigrants come from various experiences? Something that I feel like I have to push myself often as a Latina, to not just equate and assume that all undocumented people are Latinos, or that all undocumented people speak Spanish. And remember once having just a reflection with myself, being like, oh my gosh, I spent I know all these things about DACA. I know the ins and out of DACA. But if someone were to ask me about the temporary protected status, and for immigrants from different countries, primarily African countries, I have no idea what that looks like. And I I've been doing immigration work for a long time, and feel like it's, I should know this, because it comes up, it feels relevant to the kind of work that I do, but it's not the same. And I don't take the same kind of time and energy to learn. And full disclosure, I think a lot of this comes from anti-Blackness, and the fact that the immigrant community and immigrant movements has focused on Latinos and ignores the fact that the majority of people that are deported are Black immigrants. So just being real about that, and having a reflection and conversation with myself about how to dismantle anti-Blackness within my own body, within my own approach to immigrant rights. So I want to leave you with a few resources to do some of this work. So we can go to the next slide. I embedded the links in here, then realized you don't have access to the PowerPoint, so you can't click on the links, but I'll send them out to the event organizers. So the Black Alliance for Immigrant Rights does incredible work on this. This one's more, the ABISA is more Michigan focused, but if there's any Michiganders out there who would want to support, so the African Bureau of Immigrant and Social Affairs is doing incredible work. The National Immigration Law Center has really good education resources, as well as United We Dream. United We Dream, I think they still have a little bit of a way to go to create more inclusive narratives, but they do have some really good resources when it comes to education, information. And then the last one that talks about what is race class narrative, and how do we use it in our movements, in our media, in our newsletters, in our just communication with each other. So there's a website called We Make Michigan that is a narrative hub for this kind of work. And I think that's it. I will open it for a few questions in case anybody has any, and then we can wrap up.
Well, Maria, thank you so much for joining us tonight, for that amazing talk. I know there's a lot I'm going to reflect on from this, and I'm really grateful to have been here.
Thank you.